Good evening, everyone. This is the coldest fire chat I've ever had in my life, so I don't know how you guys feel, but it's an extremely cold environment. But I think the topic itself is going to be fantastic, so look forward to an interesting debate. If I can get started, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. Perhaps to set the stage, the use of analytics in central banks have been there for the longest of the time. You are a very data intensive as a regulator. You're very data intensive in the way you operate. But there's a significant push now towards using advanced analytics. And that's kind of triggered by what I call some of the pull and push factors. The pull factors would be the new data sets that you get to analyze. And there's a significant rapid increase in those that are now being available to you. And that poses a bit of an interesting challenge as well, and we'll come to that in a moment and talk about that. But how do you harness that and also be able to use it with your very sensitive financial data, and how do you bring it together? It'll be an interesting thing to talk about. But one of the things that we found out as we looked at a number of the central banks across this region as well as globally was that the recognition of the fact that data is an enterprise-wide asset and not a particular departmental functional kind of an asset seems to be an increasing awareness of that, and therefore keenness to do that. And a number of central banks have gone ahead and created CDO, Chief Data Officer organizations, which is a clear recognition of the fact that data is important to them. But I also see, on the other hand, a significant push towards harnessing the data even better than what you do today, and merely from a supervision perspective to say, how can we analyze, how can we bring in better insights that hitherto were not possible simply because you did not have access to that type of data. But there seems to be challenges associated with the way data seem to have been organized historically in the past, which is a lot of structured financial information that was made available by all the financial institutes, and data was stratified across the entire organization. So there seems to be a significant push towards kind of making that happen. And I guess the last part of it is the culture of use of data, which is always one of the biggest bugbear for any organization. So clearly, central banks are looking at it, as an important aspect of their future. In a Singapore context, Ravi Menon has made it very clear that he wants to drive this as a data-driven organization. And it's a data-driven central bank, and that's an important message to get out as well. So given that, I perhaps would now turn it over to Nick, perhaps for you to get started as a regulator. What's your perspective on this? What's your strategy? And perhaps share for the benefit of all of us here, how are you addressing it?
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So the FCA, just for a bit of context, is not a central bank. It's a regulator, as you point out. We regulate 56,000 firms in the UK. We're the conduct regulator for all of those, and we're the prudential regulator for 54,000 of them. So our intent and desire to be a data-driven regulator is in large part driven by the size and the volume of the firms that we're responsible for monitoring and regulating. I think we started probably about 3 or 4 years ago, starting to try and put our data house in order. And the early focus for us really was to start to bring some more control around the way in which we govern, manage, and treat data as an enterprise asset. Not as easy as it sounds, frankly. Sure. Particularly when a lot of data governance arrangements create roles like data owners. And it's very hard to get someone to act as an owner on behalf of an organization and not create some semblance of this is mine, stay away from it. So I think a lot of our activities early on were to try and educate people around why we felt data would be a fundamental and necessary enabler of our regulatory approach. Focusing initially on control and governance, then moving on into how do we accelerate and develop our analytics abilities. I think a few years ago, regulators, with some exceptions, most regulators did not have the deepness of pocket to pursue some of the more advanced analytics that indeed some of the markets that they regulate were already using. I think that's changed fundamentally for us. So we're now in a really positive position in that we have access to a myriad of valuable and unique data. At the same time, that the price point for the technologies to exploit that data have become more achievable for a regulator. And in our case, the massive driver and need to be a data-driven organization just drives and enforces even more firmly the steps we need to take going forward. So I think we'll talk a bit over the course of this panel on some of the new use cases for us.
Yeah.
There's a lot for us to do in making sure the way in which we gather and collect the data meets our needs going forwards, but also that those needs are met in a way that imposes a reasonable burden on the industry. And so striking a balance between all of those factors can be quite a complex juggling act, but good to share some experiences on it.
Absolutely. I was going to say we're going to come back to that because those are some of the very important topics in everyone's mind. But perhaps, David, you're more than just a regulator.
Yeah, I was about to say that from a context perspective, perhaps we don't have 56,000 firms, thank the Lord, but we are a consolidated regulator, a central bank, and financial development. So there is I guess, I don't like using the word complexity, but there's that intrigued relationship across the board in how to do that. And I actually fully agree with what Nick was saying, is that ultimately data and being data-centric, and earlier today, MD Ravi was mentioning that as part of a smart nation, you have to have also the smart financial aspect of it. Data is always positioned as an asset, but to do that, there needs to understand what, in fact, that means. Because data for the sake of data, meaning collecting data just for the sake of collecting data, in fact, is meaningless. There needs to be a purpose for it. So going down that aspect of what is being collected, how it's being stored, how is it being used, in driving ultimately value within the operational functions, and then of course unlocking further insight that can be used, and that's really, if I can abuse the term, the holy grail, in really what everyone's trying to achieve, and what other insight can we achieve from the information that we're collecting, and always the question of what else are we missing, be it from internal data that's already been collected, and in fact, if you ever look inside an organization, the wealth of data, or should I say the volume of data, is quite large. How much of it is being used, to what extent, is a different question. But of course, there's always that other dimension of what else can we augment it with, the external data, to get an understanding of behavior, and again, from a regulatory point of view, how to respond accordingly, from a policy perspective, how to be a better supervisor, from a banking perspective, and again, ultimately, how to develop the financial industry better.
So if I can perhaps ask you to not give too much away, but perhaps share again, what are some of the things you're doing? What's your strategy behind that? What kind of an approach are you taking? Recognizing the fact that all of this data is available to you, and recognition of the fact that you can make. How are you addressing it? The whole function of CDO in MAS was started a few months back.
Well, yes. So, yeah, definitely putting on the fact that this data is available. But as I mentioned, it's very cognizant that just because it's available doesn't mean it needs to be tapped on. It's down to the understanding of the purpose and the usage. So, going back to the question of that journey, I think it's very much instilling an understanding of governance. And I know a lot of folks, especially when you think of the FinTech aspect, the advanced analytics capabilities, machine learning, deep learning, and when usually someone stands up and says the word governance, there's a bit of that kind of sigh of, oh no. But it is exceptionally important, because governance isn't just the concept of, technology. Governance is understanding of what you do with data. So something you mentioned earlier about data ownership, that's a construct of data governance. If you cannot handle data, if you do not know what does it mean, how it can be shared, the security associated with it, that's when things fall apart. So the reason I'm mentioning it, because that's the very first underlying pillar, governance. And especially when we, as a regulator, collecting data from parties, we need to make sure that there's a governance in place on top of that. Secondly, it's about the whole aspect of data sharing. And again, sensitive topic, tricky, even within an organization across departments, and not too dissimilar. It's how to create that sharing, because that then unfolds the potential applications, and huge area for us, which is a supervisory technology. And that goes into aspects, and how do we understand and supervise better in terms of, from a risk perspective point of view.
So if I can interrupt you there for a moment, this is not uncommon challenge in the commercial world as well. Data governance and data ownership and data sharing are the common set of challenges. In a commercial world, it's largely easier to kind of put dictate the terms and say, thou shalt do it. I was just wondering, how are you tackling this? What are your specific set of challenges?
If I can jump on that, so perhaps I'll answer it from this perspective. So whenever I speak to, I call them colleagues, but the folks in the FIs, the CDOs there, and they always complain to me about the challenges that they have in providing me data. I always kind of say, well, whatever challenge you have, multiply it by the number of FIs that I'm actually supervising. And what that means is not just in terms of the collection of the data, is the veracity and the different types of data that's being collected. Some of them could be the most advanced, direct API connections to whatever source system, down to a PDF file that's been sent to me. So there's that complete breadth of information on data that's being collected that's all supposed to be representing the same thing, but in entirely different dimensions. And then from a collation point of view, from an understanding perspective, is how do you make sense of it? Because some things you can understand in a certain way, you can automate the procedure. Some things you just have to read because it's scanned documents. So it's really about that. It's about how do we, and I try and avoid the word standardization, maybe harmonization, that aspect of data collection. How can we still allow for that durability and flexibility across the different types of financial institutions and different types of data submissions, but at the same time making sure that and again, it was mentioned earlier today, that machine readability and usability of that data, and that's in fact underlying everything else. Whatever exciting or funky machine learning, deep learning capabilities and all that, if we do not have that ability of leveraging and understanding the data across the different dimensions, but at the same time knowing where we need to put the walls, because in times we cannot even share internally data due to the function that we're playing. So some of the core aspects of how we're dealing with it.
Great. Nick, do you want to add to that? Or?
I think the only thing I'd add, I think we share lots of similar challenges, but I think the way in which we've tried to make governance less or more palatable is through demonstrating the potential that it unlocks. So it's pretty difficult to embed a control regime without also showing the benefits that come from it.
Right.
And so I think data sharing is probably the area where it's easiest to do that, to show people that actually we can deliver valuable new insights, far deeper intelligence and analytics of your specific problem or market.
Right.
But in order to do that, we have had to enforce these governance expectations that data will be shared across the enterprise wherever possible.
Right. Thank you. Now,
sorry, just
go ahead, please.
I want to give actually one example about the data sharing, and one that I'm happy to share. I'll give you an example of it's even a semantic thing, but it fundamentally changes everything. A lot of times, whether we like it or not, data is by inclusion, meaning this is my data, you want it, please ask for it. And if I want to give it to you or not, I will give it to you. So one of the things that I'm personally trying to kind of unlock is by turning it to an exclusion aspect of it. And it's a semantics. In fact, there's no difference, because you can say, by exclusion, all of you cannot access my data. But the difference here is, one, psychological, because sometimes just people just don't want to go through the effort. And secondly, it allows for a lot more speed. Because if you can access the data, rather than now having to find the person, get the permission, get that and all that, you can simply access the data. So I just want to mention that as an actually concrete example of semantics, but results in that breadth of sharing and breadth of ability of actually getting that data communication effectively.
Great. If I can, again, for some of the audience here, as a regulator, can you share some of the use cases, how you're actually putting data to use, what's starting to change for you, and perhaps, from your perspective, how that's actually coming to fruition?
Yeah, of course. We've been using data through standard means for a long while, so I'm not going to talk about sort of dashboarding and descriptive analytics. I don't think anyone's particularly here to hear about that.
No.
So loads of use cases, actually. So in our markets area, deploying graph theory and network analytics for market abuse detection. There's not a whole lot I can say about that one, but I think you can work out how one might use transactional level markets information to identify known actors within networks, and to spot the interplay between different groups of individuals. So we hadn't really used graph analytics for that before. Presented some new challenges to us. One of the data sets we use for that is 28 billion rows, 1.7 trillion data elements, which for a regulator is really big data. It might not be big data to everyone exhibiting outside, but for us that's big. So that presented some new challenges but also some really useful new insights into the way in which different markets operate, and certainly some of the illicit markets. natural language processing, I think we talked about it before we came in. There are so many use cases in regulators for natural language processing. We still collect and have had historically vast amounts of unstructured text, whether that be policies and internal procedures documents from the firms we regulate, whether that be correspondence that we ourselves have with market participants or with consumers. We have a contact center, for instance, that gets 200,000 phone calls a year. There's a huge amount of content in the transcripts of those calls that we don't leverage as fully as we could. So some of the NLP technologies we're looking to apply there. Predictive analytics, as I mentioned, with so many thousands of firms, we have to prioritize our supervisory effort. So some of the more standard supervised machine learning algorithms, random forest techniques, those sorts of things are really helpful for us in trying to predict conduct failures within populations of firms. And now we're looking at whether we can similarly apply that to predict prudential strains, but also trying to work out how you model effects between prudential strain and conduct strain, or vice versa. You know, what is the transmission mechanism between those two sets of failure within a firm? Other examples, something we've just started, but we don't really know how to do it yet, is on the sort of image analytics, visual analytics side of things. So we get the advertisements for the creative content of the advertisements for every financial services advert in the UK, whether it be video, print, web, radio, TV. And we have done lots of work. We spent quite a lot of effort on behavioural economics, and so we did quite a lot of research looking into how are people misled by advertising. And so now we're trying to work out how do you codify what we know in terms of how people are misled by advertising into a visual analytics algorithm that detects when those methods are being used, so that we can prioritise our effort on those advertisements. So there's lots and lots. Happy to talk to people separately about them as well. I think what a lot of them have at their heart, which is one of the kind of core use cases for us, is a movement from a sample-based view of the world to a population review, which we could never do with manual resources or human resources, but we can do with technology. And there are a lot of use cases that are really focused on internal operational efficiency as well. Right. And a lot of the NLP ones talk to that need as well.
Excellent. No, that's pretty powerful use cases. David?
Yeah, just to add, because in fact there's an immense similarity. So we're using analytics, if we use it holistically, or data within the network analysis and graph theory, looking at, and again it was mentioned earlier today, on the suspicious transaction reporting, to getting a better understanding on potential AML, anti-money laundering, or countering financing of terrorism risk. Likewise within the security space, to again identifying in a much in a way that, you know, previously from a manual perspective, it just simply could not be done. Understanding, seeing the networks in a scale in which it could potentially exist and the connectivities between them, it's just something that both the data and then having the right tools on top of it from a graphing and network perspective, as well as the various predictive functions, just simply were not available previously. That is a very, very large piece, because in fact moving towards a predictive aspect of really identifying potential risk. The other one, which is huge, is the application of natural language processing. Because the amounts of data that we have, receive, collect, and this is across all functions, be it from misconduct reports all the way to news information, just to various complaints, reports, call centers that's coming in. And ultimately the challenge with written, again, be it electronically written or literally handwritten, is that it takes a lot of time of people to read it. And I'm not saying that people don't read it, but how do you prioritize it? How did you, in an efficient manner, extract information that is able to represent, what is the issue about? What are the entities associated with them? Has it been something that's previously surfaced up? How to summarize it? Having mechanisms and abilities to provide and extract that information in a, and I loosely use the term easily manner, provides any officer an immense time saving, because they can immediately see, okay, these are the buckets that it falls into. This is a high-level topic. I can read it in a lot more depth, or I can already have some remediation aspects associated with it. And this even goes, and I call it kind of the back office type of data, because I really believe that to be truly data-driven, just to share some of the applications, it's not just in our front office functions in terms of supervision, but it's even our back office. And I joke with our building folks is that we have a smart building, but now we have to have an intelligent building, and how we're using the data that's being generated for it. So that's on the other aspect. Even down to things like, comparing documents and having ability of saying that this is the same as something else. Something that, again, you may think this is really trivial, but people would spend hours doing it because you need to read word for word. And it could be across multiple documents, which can span up to 10, 15, 20, 60 pages. So I just want to emphasize, because there was a huge emphasis on the natural language processing aspect.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. No, thanks so much for that. I am going to keep those questions coming in. They are coming in thick and fast, so that's great. And, I am going to pose some of these questions along the way. So the first of the questions is, how should global financial institutions which collate global data sets overcome divergent regulatory requirements? Some regulators are open, but some are protectionist.
I'll take a jump. I see everything as data. So I think of the problem as data perspective, but it's not too dissimilar with respect to regulatory aspects. This is really, there's two folds to it. And on the first aspect, it's actually the approach that I believe collectively we're taking in how we're working with the financial institutions, that we're having a conversation. And why I'm emphasizing that point is because there is a need to surface up those challenges. A lot of times when we have conversation, especially with compliance, that doesn't come. And I think that's a very important change that needs to come to play. So that's number one. With that, it allows us as regulators to get a better understanding within the local and global ecosystem of what needs to take place. And these kind of conversations on a regulator to regulator front then does happen. So yes, there are challenges. I'll be the last person to say that they're not there. Yes, there are differences, and some of these differences would not change. But having an understanding in more depth of what they are, how to harmonize again, I'm trying to avoid the word standard because that results in a lot of potentially other issues, but harmonizing it and providing ease in operating, data provisioning, and addressing those regulations, I think is important, because it's also kind of important to keep in the background that regulating and regulation isn't just there to make everyone's life a misery. I joke with folks by telling them that it's there to protect you from yourselves. So it's there to serve a purpose. And I think as part of this whole FinTech innovation element is that equally as regulators, we're adapting and accommodating and identifying the relevancy of certain types of regulations with respect to the change of data and the ecosystem. So again, it's a conversation, it's a dialogue, but it's important to have that dialogue.
And it's just to add to your point, it's also recognition of the fact that there are going to be local financial institutes and therefore their local data sets. But global financial institutes have their own set of things to look after. And I think that's an important aspect, because that's where they're looking to saying, how are the regulators talking to each other or not, and how that's going to be harmonized. So, Nick, your perspective.
I think just something to add to that, though, is that not all regulators have the same underlying mandate.
Yeah.
As we've referenced here already, you've got a central bank with a regulatory mandate. We have no central banking operations. We don't prudentially supervise the largest firms that we conduct supervise. There's all sorts of differences between us. We have a competition mandate. Most regulators do not have a competition mandate. So we will always have differences in the information that we find most important and valuable to us. There is a degree of commonality, undoubtedly. And I think those of us that are looking at the burden imposed by regulatory reporting obligations are coming to similar future ideas, frankly. So both of us, in particular, are working on modernising regulatory reporting, leveraging open architectures to do that, establishing, where we can, underlying singular taxonomies or data models. Now, that's not to say that the FCA's and MAS's underlying data model will be identical, but it should, because we're both adopting a similar approach to how we publish this information and the architecture that we rely upon, there is a really fruitful area for RegTech solutions to spring up to just provide that mapping piece between these underlying models.
In that context, do you share data between regulators? That's, by the way, one of the questions from the public, so I didn't make this up.
So
we promised to keep this very real and very true, so keep them coming.
I don't
It's gonna be a
think
bit awkward for
in
these
practice there's much data sharing between us two, to be honest, because the data protection regimes and the legal statutes under which we've collected that data don't necessarily facilitate it. I think we share more in terms of approaches.
Perhaps if I can kind of ask you to think about, given that this is the start of a lot of this changes beginning to happen, do you see this a new trend towards how do you share these data across between regulators? Because a lot of the global financial institutes are having to deal with a number of central banks, and if do you see a trend now starting to emerge where the regulators are going to talk to each other, perhaps at some stage, and start sharing the data across?
I guess there's a question on whether that becomes necessary if we sufficiently modernise the way in which we collect data from the industry, and that if the mechanisms by which we service our needs from the firms we regulate are sufficiently more efficient than they are today, then it may not be that we need to tackle the legal aspects of international data sharing because the burden has already been sufficiently reduced for the financial institutions. I suppose in an environment where we don't make progress on reducing the cost of that collection, then we would have to look at alternatives. But I think that's the route we're pursuing at the moment.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's part of that, the discussion and understanding of the change. And there could be a scenario where there won't be the need of that from a legal burden that will stop us from doing it. But I think it's an evolution that we're all going through. And definitely, I mean, at least from a regulatory point of view, I think we're still at the onset of that evolution. And we are definitely sitting down and having those conversations. Currently at that stage, they're more on the methodological, the approach. And for example, the taxonomy, something that I think we overall, across all the conversations I have with regulators, we're all coming to the conclusion that taxonomies are extremely important, but would we have one taxonomy to rule them all? I highly doubt it. But would we have taxonomy of taxonomy? So at least we have then a mapping of the information that's being collected across different regulators. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I see that as being very rational. And then if you have the need of actually sharing data across, it also becomes easier because we at least have an understanding of what is being collected and what it means.
Okay, fantastic. And perhaps to shift gears a bit, looking from an outside perspective, the industry provides a lot of data. And in a Singapore context, that's going to substantially increase as well over the course of the time. And it's an interesting, and every time I talk to a lot of the banks, and that's the biggest of the concerns about, okay, we're going to share all of this data. What's going to happen? How are we going to benefit out of this? How is this going to uplift this entire industry as a whole? So, as we're moving into using a lot of this data, where do you see that? Because I think it's an important question that everyone's mind.
I think two elements here. And the first one is a bit of a tally-on of what I was previously mentioning about taxonomy, because I think volume of data shouldn't be that first impetus of fear of what's happening here. Because I think in terms of magnitude, different regulators, collect in far greater magnitudes of what we are or will collect. And I think it's very much then again down to the underlying, do you understand what's being provided, or do we understand what's actually being requested? So such having open taxonomies are extremely important. And so that's the first part. And I think that's a perspective and a viewpoint on how data is basically being provisioned. On the second perspective, there's a change of intent. And I emphasize the word intent because we are still in the process of figuring it out how. But the underlying intent is to share back. Again, of course, it won't be a scenario, an FI provides data, there's that due diligence and governance to make sure that data is kept and maintained, and it will not be provided outside. But, aggregates of information across the board, aspects of it, changes, trends. Again, like I mentioned, it's something that's very much still in the works, very much trying to be understood, but the intent is in the ability of providing back, not just even to financial institutions, but perhaps to organizations, research, and so forth, so that there's an overall progression in moving forward in that path of innovation.
Right. Talking about that, this whole aspect of data collection and data preparation that happens, which is hugely time-consuming, given the way that's organized today. Do you see that change going forward?
I very much hope so. I know this is relatively sensitive topic, especially when it comes to the whole process of robotic automation and all that. However, I take a different viewpoint in it in terms of operational risk. And to me, when things are done manually in terms of preparation, there's a huge operational risk element of it. So if you think of it again from an ops point of view of maker and checker, I would very much like to see the maker aspect of it to being automated. So that's, again, the checking of quality and the preparation of data. The checker aspect of it should still be that human verification. It's really what needs to be done. So going to your point is, I think that is really the path that we all should be taking, because to making sure that the durability, as the volume of data is increasing, as the granularity of data is decreasing, because the granularity, again, it's a very subjective construct. There would be a need ability to making sure we have a continuous mechanism to handle it. So,
Nick, do you have anything to add to that?
Very similar. I think one of the things we need to tackle is data being cleansed more than once. So it's been talked about earlier, data being collected more than once. The way in which the operating models of regulators currently operate is that often data will be cleaned in multiple places for bespoke use cases. I don't think we want to see that happening to the same degree anymore. So I think we will move towards a more systematic cleansing of data. And I think that probably starts to tie into what is the operating model for analytics in an organization. And the approach that we're taking is really to build out a center of excellence that coordinates the analytics efforts of the organization. And it would be that area that, to some extent, sets the rules of the game when it comes to cleansing, but with a view that you can then federate analytics effort across the organization, but everyone's using this same trusted, cleansed version of the data. So I think, echo a lot of what David said, but that's certainly an area that we need to tackle, is not duplicating cleansing.
All right. Thanks for that. And perhaps shifting again a bit, talking about the data itself. And I guess one of the things around the sensitivity of the data that you have, and then all this new set of data that starts to become available, a lot of them are public set of data. How do you kind of balance between the need to have a very secured set of data that you can work with, and also kind of not constrain yourself from harvesting all this new set of data and driving more of the innovative new use of analytics? How do you balance between the two, and what are some of the privacy-related considerations in here?
So I think the way we've tended to do this is we've tended to use open and public data sets to prove the value of analytics approaches, technologies, and techniques, and then productionize those into environments that can handle our more sensitive data. So to some extent, we're using the public sources to prove out the use cases, which is stopping us spending a fortune on deploying technologies into development, into production environments where they're unproven. I think the challenge we face is the same as the industries, though, in terms of how do we bring together these different data sets, and how do we ensure that we've got the sufficient master data management and entity reference data management systems that enable us to link all these different data sets together. So I think when it comes to that, that's an area where we continue to engage quite extensively with the industry in the UK to say, how does one go about doing this most efficiently? I think we will always collect sensitive data that's not publicly available. There's just no doubt that will continue. So I think we're doing as much as we can to make that effort as efficient as possible, but also making sure that where a public data set fulfills the need that sensitive data set previously fulfilled, that we have the honesty and the humility to say, actually, we don't need that from you anymore. We can get that from a public source. So I think you've got to try and strike the balance between the two data sets. But we fundamentally have to protect that highly sensitive data that you have, and we can never lose sight of that obligation.
Right.
So on the second part, I think it doesn't inhibit us of the type of analytical applications that we're exploring in terms of the accessibility and the sensitivity of the data. I think very similar that if we can get things from external perspective, we would just go ahead and do it. But a lot of times that may not be the case. I guess for us, we've kind of taken a slightly different approach. I always like to call it a non-linear approach, in that we will effectively leverage on the data that we have, and a lot of times it'll be internal data, on a much small scale, even though it's still not cleansed perfectly, there's still missing aspects, try something out, demonstrate the value internally to ourselves before actually saying, okay, we need to start getting all the piping and everything together. But straight away applying it on internal data, but of course applying the due diligence and the governance on top of it to making sure that it's maintained as the way it needs to be maintained. So I think to a certain degree that, and I think it's also because the volume and degree of data that we already have is quite extensive. And it's about almost justifying, again, from the approach that we've taken, that we already are collecting it. We already have this data. We need to milk it. Because, I mean, maybe this is the point when I say, I mean, a bit more of a personal point of view, that if an item is not used, if a data item is not used, I should not collect it. And this is a bit of, again, I always call it not eureka moment, but a bit of a pivotal change in my approach towards data. Whereas previously it's a case of just give me as much as possible because I don't know when I'll need it or how I need it, to more of a bit of a conservative perspective. Like, yeah, have that ability to explore, experiment, include, but if that necessity of data is not there, then you almost backtrack a bit and say, well, I don't need it. So thank you very much. I'm not going to use it anymore until that point in times when I do need to use it. But again, it's a bit of a straddle between the two.
I think, sorry, just to add though, that part of the reason that we've adopted the approach we have is because we're trying to prove out these technologies in an unproven cloud environment. So we weren't in a position to put production data into the same place that we were experimenting with tools and technologies that were equally unproven from a security perspective. So I wouldn't necessarily say it was conscious that we chose public over exploitation of our internal data. It was more that where we wanted to put it meant that we had to prove it out first.
Talking about cloud, I got a very interesting question from the audience here, which is, do you ever envisage that a financial institution or a FinTech firm create its entire architecture, including data, on the cloud and avoid regulation and perhaps having to give you the data?
Well, this is the point when I'm half expecting something to jump up and go, use the cloud. Well, I think we've been fairly clear on, and we've came up several points in time that as long as the various regulations, policies adhere to, whether it's sitting on-prem or off-prem, it's really a business call. In fact, from adoption perspective, we're aspiring as well to using more cloud. So it's not a case of avoiding regulation. It still be subjected to regulation because ultimately it's the purpose. So you'll still have the due diligence of maintaining the secrecy and the security of the data. Be it on-prem or off-prem doesn't change that. So as long as you can prove that burden in that scenario, all's good. Likewise, again, in the provisioning of the data, be it what the data is, and so forth and so forth. So I think from a cloud perspective, very open to it. And again, in the cases which are new, which have not been tested, the approach that has been taken so far is let's sit down and have a conversation. Just because currently it's like so, doesn't mean it has to stay that way if we do not really understand the setup, the environment, or the underlying conditions.
Okay. Nick, I'd be interested in your views. Again, UK is perhaps one of those advanced markets when it comes to challenger banks and a lot of the FinTech that operate in there. How are you starting to see that from a regulatory perspective and from access to the data, et cetera, if everything's on the cloud?
It frankly makes no difference to us where it's stored. Most of the decisions around IT outsourcing, our requirements are the same, whether you're using a cloud provider or it's on-prem, whether you're buying IBM or an unknown. The expectation is that the firm's management properly assesses the risks and manages the risks that poses to their business. So it frankly makes no difference to us. We are, however, seeking to learn more about cloud environments because we want to use them ourselves. And certainly seeing some of the cloud native businesses come through things like our sandbox has been really helpful in helping us understand how they manage those risks. Right. But once you become a regulated firm, the expectation is the same, regardless of where you decide to host your data.
Excellent. Okay. Again, taking cue from one of the questions from the audience, will the regulators be opening up data for public use, non-confidential data, that is? And this whole discussion around publishing data. Yeah. And again, my experience, just to share that very quickly, there's varying degrees of data being made available by central banks across the wide spectrum. And it seems to be some are willing to share a lot more, some are kind of testing it out there and in trying to see how best to kind of do that. But very interested in seeing how you're tackling that.
Oh, no, to me, it's very clear cut. The intent is to share. Again, we are working out the details, the what, the how, and it's not an easy thing to work out, but the intent, the underlying intent is to share. Ultimately, we need to make sure that whatever is shared across is not sensitive data and it does not put in any harm and so forth. But the knowledge that there is information that would be extremely beneficial to organizations in there. So again, the intent is there. I mean, there could be a scenario where it will be very helpful to us to understand even what is the kind of data that would help, be it the public or companies, or organizations, financial institutions, because it could be a scenario that we do have the data, we do have the information. We're not even aware that it may be of particular use in certain scenarios, and again, it's not even sensitive. So it's really having that, it kind of falls into almost like a research track conversations to understand. But again, I can't stress it any further than the intent is to share.
Okay.
Echo that really. We share quite a bit of our data already. And also, as a public body in the UK, people can request data from us under the Freedom of Information Act. So we have to provide data in certain circumstances anyway. The challenge, though, is balancing publication and utility of that data, because we can't publish sensitive, confidential information. So we either have to obfuscate it in some way or aggregate it in some way. And traditional tools and methods for doing that tend to fundamentally erode the analytical value of the data.
Right.
So I think we're engaged with a few kind of privacy engineering companies and those that are sort of active in the field of differential privacy to look at how might we sufficiently mask and anonymize our data but retain a degree of analytical validity to it. And trying to strike that balance can be quite tricky. I think the UK generally has got this fairly strong kind of open government transparency initiative, but some of the criticism that comes back is just because you publish it doesn't mean it's actually usable. The National Health Service, for instance, gets criticised. It publishes data, but it publishes it in hundreds of underlying spreadsheets that unless you're a data scientist with a bit of Python coding ability, you can't recreate the complete data set. So we need to try and strike that balance between what really does useful data look like and how do we balance the security obfuscation that we need to do to still make it useful.
Just to echo the fact that that's absolutely true, that it's a combination of the utility of the data being shared. Again, just like I mentioned earlier, collecting data for the sake of collecting data doesn't make sense. Sharing data just for the sake of sharing data also doesn't make sense if there's no use of it. Again, the use can be defined through multiple approaches, but it needs to be there. And that also goes hand in hand with the obfuscation of data, because it could be a scenario that there is an intent of sharing, there is a value, but because it has to go through that due diligence of obscuring the data effectively, it does no longer become useful. And then the sharing, again, defeats the point. So we may say, okay, we'll share with you. Here, I've not just anonymized, I put some differential anonymizations, great. But we also have to be sufficiently kind of self-aware by saying, well, look, this is going to be of absolutely no value to you.
Yeah. And perhaps, if I can ask from one of the challenges I've seen over the number of years in the commercial world, when you look at a lot of the data initiatives, have had mixed results. And a lot part of it has got to do with not making them available, but actually putting them to use. And that seems to be a big divide. And the other set of challenges seem to be around sustaining the momentum over a longer period of time. And it can kind of fall into an overhype versus your ability to deliver upon that. And kind of use this analogy of data lake versus a data swamp kind of a scenario. What are your challenges, and how are you, and again, there are varying degrees of maturity in any organization when it comes to the use of analytics. Yeah. I'd be interested in how, what your set of challenges are.
I'm just smiling because of your point about the market or the hype associated. And just to share with you a very kind of short story. So I studied a field, a while back ago called machine learning. And then when I kind of started working in the field, it was business intelligence, then it was business analytics, then I think it had something in between, then it was data science. And I remember a few years ago, someone said to me, oh, David, have you heard about machine learning? So now it's moved to deep learning. So there's immense hype. And don't get me wrong, there is underlying genuine value and essence being it, but there's a lot of a lot of hype. I was just talking to someone the other day who said to me that 81 or 91% of all startup firms that they see are machine learning and artificial intelligence firms. What are they really doing? So I think that's extremely, extremely important, because one of the biggest challenges in driving a continuous momentum is realizing that there's effectively two things that need to be straddled again. On the one hand is the very, if I use the term, unsexy, boring, solving the problems that everyone's complaining about. But again, it's almost a case of like, oh, really, is that all you're doing? But you're actually solving real challenges and real operational issues. But on the other hand, not just doing that, but seeing the innovation, the value, the delta that can be done, that someone has never even thought before. And it's how to do it in the right balance, because just doing this, you really lose the interest. Just doing this, people start asking you, but what's the real application? What's the real application? What's the real application? I mean, however much one can advocate the culture of allowing failure, it can't be everything that fails. It needs to be that success. So I think a lot of times, this is at times the biggest challenge, because it encapsulates several things. It encapsulates the technology and the readiness of technology. Sometimes the technology that we're trying to use, we know it's not ready. It's ready for a proof of concept. It's ready for an attempt. It's ready for a trial. But it's not ready to be used operationally. There's no actual, well, I don't want to say the word actual value, but operational value, effectively. The second one is culture, which is a real thing. And I'm not saying it from a negative sense. It's the culture and how do we change.
Perhaps if you can share how we are addressing the cultural.
So it's really about that. It's demonstrating the value. And that's, to me, not the easiest, but the most substantial way of addressing culture, is that it's not just a hype. And I'll give you another example with respect to culture. Data. When I say the word data, what do you think of? A lot of people will start thinking about Excel spreadsheets or all these, matrix kind of numbers. And when you sit down saying, no, your email is data. That document you're reading is data. So suddenly realizing that, and realizing that a lot more challenges that you're facing are data challenges, is already change of culture. When someone tells me, David, I have no data challenges, I'm like, let's sit down and have a conversation. That's one way. And then finally, it's perception. Perception of what can be done and whether it should be done. And that's a bit of, I like to call it maintaining a healthy like conflict to a certain degree, making kind of constantly pushing the boundaries a bit, but at the same time demonstrating that there is that value associated with it.
Right. Nick, your experience, and we got a minute.
Yeah, okay, I'll be quick then. I think all of us so the market does have quite a bit of hype in it, and we, like many other buyers, are at risk of procuring alchemy. So I think the way we're trying to tackle that is actually through partnership with the academic community. So that's the sort of the source of helpful counsel and guidance to us, where if someone walks in and tells us this is a £10 million problem, here's your solution to it, we can go out to the academic world and say, really, is this cutting edge? Because if it's not, we're not paying 10 million quid for it. So I think having trusted advisors in that not-for-profit environment is really helpful. I think linked to that, though, as well, we've touched on it a couple of times, 19 seconds. We don't have to move from what we do today to complex neural network deep learning overnight. There's a lot of our use cases that can be supported through what many in the industry would consider relatively modest progression in our analytics capabilities. And it's that capability point that is going to be the thing that gives us some momentum long term. We need to invest in the talent and the capabilities that we need to do this.
Fantastic.
As an organization.
One sentence, and just to re-echo what Nick has said, is that analytics data is great. I mean, I'll be the last person to do it. I'm fully biased, I admit it. But it needs to be operational. Mm-hmm. It needs to be used. That's it. The moment it's used, to me, I am a believer that people will believe and will see the value and will continue to use it. But if it's not used, that's when it just stays hype. It just stays as a construct, effectively.
Great. Thanks, gentlemen. Again, to summarize, in my talk to you guys, clearly, this seems to be a significant shift in the way data has been seen in the past, and the data is going to be used now and going forward. Clearly, that's going to benefit not just from a regulatory perspective, but how to uplift the entire industry as well as you start doing that. And it still is out there, it still is evolving, so we are going to see some of that as it kind of evolves. But clearly the trend and shift is towards making use of it. So thank you so much. And I'm kind of looking forward to the day when artificial intelligence is going to prevent another global financial crisis. On that note, thank you all.